What if stories and legends could offer us the key to the hottest political issues of the day? What if all the answers to today's burning questions were presented in easy-to-digest narratives and myths? Join us as we examine some of the most fascinating tales, some mythological, some historical, and apply those lessons to the chaos of modern politics. With your host, Mark Angelides, welcome to The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, a LibertyNation.com production.
It's taken over the airwaves, and real-world impacts are growing at an exponential rate. The latest coronavirus. San Francisco has recently discovered its first untraceable case, signifying that there are infected people wandering around who don't even know they're sick. And what we hear in the media is hype, hyperbole, and naturally demands for action to be taken by those in authority. But what are the demands the press and cognoscenti are urgently calling for? Are they science and logic-based approaches that would actually prevent the spread of the disease? Or have we reached a point in our society where it is better to offer faux sincere virtue-signalling suggestions rather than effective propositions that may upset some of the more sensitive souls? Perhaps we thought we were beyond the age of ignorance when it comes to dealing with disease outbreaks. Perhaps we assumed that practical solutions were better than vapid sound bites for cultural kudos. Or perhaps not. If we look at the history of pandemics and fighting diseases, there may be one or two lessons we can actually learn. In fact, some of the responses to threats like the Black Death, that were ridiculous at the time and ineffectual, may well be just the thing to apply right now. In this edition of The Rabbit Hole, we're going to look at the big boy of pandemics, the Black Death, the bubonic plague, and explore some of the mysteries and oddities that surrounded it, in the hopes of casting some light on today's issue. When we think of the Black Death, we often associate it with a pestilence that swept Europe from around 1347, that went on to kill a third of all Europeans. But the roots are much earlier. In fact, already by 1340, people had heard of a terrible plague ravaging such far-flung places as China, Egypt, and Syria. It was in October of 1347 that it first arrived on European shores, aboard a dozen ships docking at Messina in Sicily. This was the first mistake. The people of the day knew that there was a deadly plague in foreign lands, but they didn't understand that such a thing could be transmitted. It's estimated that China, with its enormous population, lost 50% of all its people, some 60 million souls at the time. And while the situation was certainly exacerbated by the factors like famine and warfare, this was a big deal worldwide, and one that should have put people on guard. But these Europeans were simple folk who did not have the modern knowledge we have today. They didn't know or couldn't understand that by closing their ports, they could have prevented the loss of 20 million lives. When the boats arrived, they found dead and dying sailors covered in dark black boils. The port authorities ordered the ships to be taken out of the harbour, but sadly it was far too late. Within 6 months, it had reached London, Bordeaux, and pretty much every reach of the continent. Centuries earlier, the father of medicine, Hippocrates, and others had written on the subject of plagues spreading and what one should do about them. They wrote, "Cito longe tarde," which translates to, "Leave quickly, go far away, and come back slowly." Wise words indeed. The people of the day, not knowing of science and medicine in the way we understand it today, many of them turned to religion to save them from the great pestilence. Wealthy Christians would tour town to town, beginning a penance of flagellation, beating themselves in the hopes that their sins would be forgiven and that their mortal bodies would be saved. And in a strange way, this reminds me a little of our media types today who bemoan the response of governments, call for action, but stop short of ever saying those dreaded, cursed words, "Close the border." It seems as they are flagellating themselves to a god of political correctness, willing to endure, to sacrifice, if only they can be deemed virtuous by their small yet significant bubble. Other religions fared just as poorly. The Islamic faith saw the plague as being from God, and should therefore not be run away from. In fact, it was forbidden by Islamic doctrine to flee. Regardless of the religion, the disease carried on doing its fatal damage. I've mentioned a couple of times now about closing borders. If they had been shut when those ships docked in Messina, who knows what the outcome would have been. But after that, no amount of border control could have helped. The disease was carried by fleas on rats, farm animals, wild animals, and small creatures pay no mind to national boundaries. It would have had no real impact. Yet today, in the modern world, and with this particular type of coronavirus, which so far only seems to be spreading between humans, closed borders would stop the disease spreading. We should be wary not to make the initial mistake of the Sicilians. In 1348, authorities in Venice figured it was time to take action and began stopping ships coming in from ports where they suspected the plague existed. They closed the city waters, and all ships that came in were subject to a 40-day isolation period. And this is actually where we get the word quarantine from, the Italian for 40 being quaranta. But it was already far too late. The disease was in and the toll was devastating to the region. However, across much of Europe, these lessons were learned. In some places where they imposed harsh measures, isolation and limiting of travel, the disease passed quickly. Others were not so lucky. Eventually the disease ran its course, leaving a third of all Europeans dead, but the survivors perhaps a little wiser. More than 200 years later, in 1665, the plague came back in force to London. Forewarned is forearmed, and King Charles II and his government swiftly left the city, leaving orders that those who were sick were to be quarantined, bodies were to be burned, and all public gatherings to be shut down. Cities across the nation closed down access, blocked all trade, and waited. Several other cities were infected, some to a devastating degree. But despite London losing 15% of its population, almost 100,000 people, the cold weather came, and with it the end of the spread. If they had not taken the action of shutting down whole cities, and in Scotland's case, a whole border, who knows how far the disease would have gone. The main lesson we can take away from this is that when you need to act, act fast and act effectively. As far as we know right now, the coronavirus is not that deadly. Yes, some have died, and likely many more will be infected before it runs its course, but it's not the Black Death. We don't need to panic, and we don't need to start flagellating ourselves either, literally or in a figurative virtue-signaling manner, but we do need to take heed of history. Those who would risk all in the name of a progressive open border agenda are dangerous. They will sacrifice and they will discard, just so long as they can claim superiority when the dust finally settles. It's time to cast off the bounds of this ultra-modern ideology and start embracing some tried, tested, and effective common sense.
Thank you for listening to The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose, a LibertyNation.com production. Join us next time for more history, politics, legends, and stories.
Liberty Nation Gen Z. Becoming a strong defender of freedom and liberty doesn't just happen, it's taught. LN Gen Z is your portal for news that's hot, engaging articles without the spin. Go to lngenz.com for riveting videos that foster critical thinking. Download worksheets and quizzes for each age level. At lngenz.com, the future starts today. Combating propaganda. Defending freedom. lngenz.com. A free-thinking future starts here.